you to this next session, which is the official title of which is Crusade, Bush Foreign Policies. We have two papers. The second of the two to be presented will be called Fighting Two Wars by Jack Covarrubias and Tom Lansford. They are both from the University of Southern Mississippi. Our first paper is titled Forging an American Empire. It's by Lawrence Korb and Laura Conley of the Center for American Progress. We have with us Larry Korb, who will do the presentation. So, Larry, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here and to get involved in this conference about judging President Bush. When you're judging presidents and we hold up these ideal criteria, I'm always reminded of the story of the two elderly women who were sitting in the leisure village. And one said to the other, she said, "I've got news for you." The other one said, "Well, what's that?" She said, "I'm going to get married." She said, "You're going to get married again at your age? Does he have a lot of money?" "Nah, just his Social Security." She said, "Is he good looking?" He's kind of plain." Somewhat sheepishly said, "Is he a good lover?" She said, "We haven't even made love yet." She said, "Why are you doing this?" "Because he can drive at night." And of course, that, sometimes we put the criteria up and we got to settle for somebody who can drive at night. The other thing in early discussions, and last night I was reminded of, we talk about the analysis and the process by which you're making decisions. One of the most difficult things for academics, scholars, when you go into government is to realize how little good, solid analysis gets to the top decision makers, because what happens is people are expected to go in and argue a position based upon what Gray Mallisons argue. Where you stand depends on where you sit. And I remember that I had to prepare a paper for President Reagan about keeping draft registration. Young people, that's very something that impacts your lives. And I wrote the paper, and the night before the NSC meeting, I got a call at home from the Secretary of Defense, and he said, "The Chief of Staff of the Army's called me, and he's very upset about the paper." And I said, "Well, sir, have you read it?" He said, "No, he hadn't," which is another thing I found. A lot of people don't read the papers before the meetings. He said, "But call General Myers and see what's going on." So I called him, and I said, "General, I understand you have a problem with the paper." He said, "Yes, it presents a balanced viewpoint. You work for the Pentagon, you should only present our side so the president makes what we call the right decision." So, I mean, when you get in, and I used to see that an awful lot, and you'd sit there and you'd say, "My goodness, you're not a lawyer arguing for your department. You're supposed to be presenting, I use the Fox term, fair and balanced," but nonetheless, that doesn't happen. Now, I'm going to do two things here today. First, I'm going to say something nice about President Bush. His national security strategy, which was written in 2002 and reissued in 2006, basically compared to all of the other national security strategies that have been sent up by Presidents Reagan, the first President Bush, and President Clinton after the law in 1986 was passed that said you had to send one up. It's probably the clearest, the most consistent, and the easiest to read. For those of you interested in it, you can go on the White House website. It's written 40 pages. And as the president is reported to have told the people writing it, "I want it written so the boys in Lubbock could understand it." And I think they can. The problem is the strategy. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Now, our chairman is Dave is going to talk. He's going to summarize the chapter in this book by Kaufman that says good things about the Bush Doctrine. Let me say some things that I think are important to understand how it led to sort of forging an American empire. If you say, well, what does the Bush Doctrine mean? And as Governor Palin found out, it could mean an awful lot of things. As I look at it, it basically has four components. And the first component is that the United States basically is going to act unilaterally. And this came up even before 9/11. I know everybody says, well, it all started in 9/11, and probably without 9/11, the president would have focused on his domestic agenda. But even before 9/11, the Bush administration unsigned, this was the first time in history, the International Criminal Court that President Clinton had signed. It opted out of Kyoto, which annoyed my governor. I was then living in New Jersey, and she left the governorship to go work on Kyoto. Even didn't work on the biological weapons protocol. And remember, the biological weapons, getting rid of that had actually been started by President Nixon. So that it was clear that President Bush had sort of reversed the traditional approach to foreign policy, which was multilateral if we can, unilateral only if we must. They sort of looked at, so the international community was a constraint on the United States protecting its own security, and I'll leave it to the rest of the people here to decide whether that was Cheney or how it came about, but the fact of the matter is that there was even before 9/11. In fact, right after 9/11, I wrote a piece basically saying, maybe this will be the end of unilateralism given, you know, what happened. Well, of course, that didn't turn out to be true. And then if you look at the strategy, the key thing, in my view, is this idea of preventive war. And it's not preemption, as they talk about, because if you read that strategy, basically it gives the idea of preventive war, that, in fact, you do not have to have an immediate threat before the United States goes to war against another state. And go back and look, Bush never used the term immediate threat from Iraq. Ari Fleischer did once, but Bush never did it. Now, if you accept that, you have a whole new standard of behavior in international relations. For example, let's say the phone rings at 3 o'clock in the morning, and it's picked up, and President Obama says, this is the Indian Prime Minister. We've had it with Pakistan. That government's about to fail. Don't tell them with the nuclear weapons. We're going in. And you say, no, no, no. Hold on. Let's, take this to the international community. Well, if we could go into Iraq, okay, when it did not pose an immediate threat, in fact, we've set a new standard of international behavior. The other thing is that if you buy the preventive war, the whole concept of deterrence and containment is out the window. I mean, 9/11 changed things, but it did not change the international environment and all the standards completely. Now, this idea of preventive war is based upon two concepts. One is American exceptionalism. We would not go to war unless it was for the good of mankind. And so, even though this is a new doctrine, and the president says many times, these values that we're fighting to uphold are not God's gift to the American people, they're God's gift to humanity. And the other is American power. That, we're a power without peer, American hegemony, and, we can do this. So with our power and values, we can accomplish our goals. Which leads to the second part of or the third part, if you count unilateral as the first part, is military dominance. That the United States should maintain military dominance regardless of the cost. And again, we can do that because we're a wealthy nation and we have this superb military. And basically, if you read between the lines there, that's really kind of directed against China. Like, don't even think about competing with us. We're so far ahead, and we'll be able to maintain this dominance. And then the final part is that the United States, to protect its security and also to uphold its values, has the responsibility to push democracy around the world, even by force of arms. That, in fact, you're not going to negotiate with these rogue states. You're going to have regime change. Now, again, that's much different than previous approaches by both Republicans and Democrats to foreign policy. What the goal used to be stability first, and democracy, obviously, if you can. Now, when you deal with the neoconservatives, and I once had the pleasure of debating Bill Kristol before the American Conservative Union. This is a group that's already invited Sarah Palin next year to to speak. But in terms of the whole idea of foreign policy, the idea that, you know, democracy, you know, even by force of arms should be a goal, they'll say, well, this is Woodrow Wilson said this, Ronald Reagan said this. No, they didn't. Woodrow Wilson said make the world safe for democracy. He didn't say make it democratic. And even President Reagan, the president I had the privilege of working for, said, Mr. Gorbachev tear down the wall. He didn't tear it down. And I think that's where the difference is. And I think it's not surprising that right as we're getting ready to go to Iraq, Brent Scowcroft, you know, wrote this article about we really should focus on the situation between the Arabs and the Israelis, and that was the key issue in that part of the world. And he had this dinner with Conley Rice, who got upset about the article, and she said, no, we've got to change things in the Middle East. 50 years of failed policy, what have they brought us? And Scowcroft said stability, basically, is what happened. So it is revolutionary. It is, you know, well written. As I say, I think it is the incorrect way. And even Bush himself has backed off on most of those goals. So in the last campaign, I thought it was rather interesting. John McCain was kind of Bush in 2002, and Senator Obama was Bush in the second administration in terms of, you know, negotiating with the North Koreans and talking to the Iranians. Now let me conclude, make a few comments. You read the strategy, and I focus a lot of my paper on this. In this strategy, Bush makes a number of statements. You want to champion aspirations for human dignity. Great idea. Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, that certainly doesn't help. Strengthen alliances to defeat terrorism. NATO invoked Article 5. We pushed them aside. We went into Afghanistan without them. And then we told NATO, well, we've done all the hard work. You guys just come in and do the peacekeeping. Well, it turned out it wasn't quite over. And so we, you know, basically it would cause a real problem in the alliance. And then the other thing is that for NATO members, you go to Europe, Bush keeps talking about Iraq and Afghanistan together. You know, we freed 50 million people from tyranny and all that. Well, in Europe, what happens, they lump the two together, and so they don't want to support the war in Afghanistan. And so when you take a look at the alliance there, it's really, you know, in difficult shape. Work with others to diffuse regional conflicts. Again, you go into Iraq with the coalition of the willing, and basically do not, you know, get the international community on your side. And really, it's hard to work with others now because, again, the opinion of the United States in the world is so low. Prevent enemies from getting WMD. Well, he said we wouldn't let North Korea get them. They got them. And the question is now, you know, if you had not broken off the negotiations. And it's very interesting in this administration, the real tragic figure, Shakespeare was writing this, is Colin Powell. Because Powell comes in, wants to pick up where Clinton had left off in the Middle East negotiations with North Korea. They push him aside, and of course, it hasn't worked well, and we have increased. North Korea probably has them, and Iran is getting closer. Now, let me give you one example from my own experience. I didn't put it in the paper that I had with Iran. In 2001, I was working at the Council on Foreign Relations up in New York, and you know that Iran has a embassy in New York because they're in the United Nations. And I guess they're allowed to go into Central Park, and that's it, or whatever how far they can go. And I had this august position there, director of research and chair of this and that. And anyway, so I get the call from the Iranian ambassador one day and says, I'd like you to come over for dinner, and this is in late September 2001, basically because we'd like, and bring your scholars who work on our part of the world. Anyway, make a long story, I should go over for dinner. Basically, the message was, tell your administration, because I think they thought the council had a lot more influence than it does, but nonetheless, pass this message, we're with you in Afghanistan, we don't like the Taliban. And remember, people forget this, not only did Iran condemn the attacks of 9/11, in one of their, as they call it, football games, they had a moment of silence for us. And, you know, we're with you, and so anyway, we passed the message. I called Conley Rice, and I'm sure she already knew it. Then, of course, in January, they get put on the axis of evil. This time I get another call, no dinner or anything like this, like, what's going on? And again, you know, in terms of, you know, preventing our enemies from getting WMD, that certainly didn't help. Develop agendas for cooperative action with others. Again, it's sort of our way or the highway, rather than, you know, working to develop these things. And then, of course, it's the final thing, they want to work with major centers of global power, and then, of course, look at the situation with the Russians. So let me conclude on this. With Russia, and that become the big you know, resurgent Russia in our relations with Russia. We have no priority in our relations with Russia. Okay, we have strategic interests. One, get them to work with us on Iran. Number two, decline of nuclear weapons. So what do? We go into Poland and the Czech Republic with a, you know, the missile system, and we talk about NATO expansion. Well, those two are not you know, great strategic interests for the United States, but they're going to undermine your first two, and so it makes it difficult to work with that. Final thought, I don't fall in favor to get it in my paper, but yesterday an NIE came out, and it said that by 2025, the United States power is going to decline. I think it was inevitable. The American hegemony, the unipolar moment wasn't going to last forever, but this administration sure basically accelerated the moment when it ended. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Jack and I flipped a coin to see who would give the presentation, and I lost. So unfortunately, you'll have to bear with me on this, because he actually wrote most of the paper, and I just put my name on it, which is what you do with former graduate students. So, George W. Bush will be the first president in quite some time to leave office with the United States still engaged in major wars. The last president to do so really was Lyndon Johnson. Before him, the last president was Truman. And to a large extent, the exercise that we're undertaking today is to determine whether or not Bush will emerge as a Johnson-esque figure, or if he's going to emerge more as a Truman-esque figure. I have to confess that I began life as a historian. Both my undergraduate and master's degrees were in history, and I only came late into the field of political science once I saw that it made so much more money than the other academic disciplines. But the reason I bring that up is that I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of U.S. military strategy and U.S. military doctrine, because it helps us understand where the United States is at right now and why the United States is where we're at. From World War II onward through most of the 20th century, U.S. military doctrine was based on the premise that the United States had to be able to fight two major wars simultaneously: a Europe-style campaign from World War II and a Pacific-style campaign from World War II. That doctrine was expanded under Kennedy, who actually wanted the United States to be able to undertake not just two major wars, but two major wars simultaneously, along with at least one regional conflict. By the end of the Cold War, the first President Bush winnows it down even a little bit further, so that the United States is required to have the ability to fight two regional conflicts simultaneously. That continues into the Clinton administration with a slight twist, and the Clinton administration puts in place what came to be known as the win, hold 'em, win strategy. The idea was that the United States would still have to have the ability to fight two regional wars simultaneously, but it really only needed the power to win one conflict while maintaining the second, and then once the first conflict was won, you would shift resources from that first conflict to the second conflict and be able to win it. All of this occurs concurrently with some fairly dramatic shifts in the way the United States employs and deploys military troops. And the most significant of that were a series of reforms that were put in place in the 1970s when Abrams was Chief of Staff of the Army. And the second reason, interestingly enough, was done in the mistaken belief that if you had to use the National Guard or reserves, the country would be less likely to go to war. and if it did go to war, it would only do so if there was broad bipartisan and congressional support. That unfortunately has turned out not necessarily to be the case, but what it's resulted in is a military that doesn't have the same kind of immediate conventional capabilities that it used to have. Instead, it's a military that relies on local firemen, police officers, sheriff's deputies, EMTs, etc. And when you do have to call up the reserves and National Guard, it causes dramatic disruptions in local communities. One of the things that happens when the Bush administration comes into office is, quite adroitly, they understand that at that time, America's force posture was still really tied to the Cold War. During the 1990s, while there were a succession of bottom-up reviews and defense reviews on how to reform the military, the reality is not much had really changed. So one of Rumsfeld's first tasks when he came into office was to begin to reform the Pentagon, begin to reform the Department of Defense, to do two things. The first was to reassert civilian control over the military, because there was this perception that the generals had really run rampant around the succession of secretaries of defense in the Clinton years. So the first thing was get the Pentagon back under civilian control. The second thing was to reorder America's military capabilities so it would be a leaner, more efficient, more mobile fighting force, and move away from the large standing Cold War structures that emphasized heavy armor and that sort of thing. Undermining, or not undermining, but undergirding all of this, the strategy to be able to fight, two regional wars, the effort to reform military capabilities. Bush comes into office with the Weinberger-Powell Doctrine still firmly in place. And this was a doctrine initially developed by Secretary of Defense Weinberger and then revised slightly under Colin Powell, that really had guided the use of force through the 1990s and into 2000. The Weinberger-Powell Doctrine really has 6 major points. I'd like to go through them quickly. The first is that military force should only be used to protect America's vital interest. The second is that any time you get into a military conflict, there has to be a clear end state. The third is that the mission has to have adequate resources and it has to have adequate forces. Fourth, and related to number 3, there has to be constant analysis of the military operation so that forces and resources can be adjusted as needed. They could be bolstered or they could be reduced. Fifth, operations had to have the support of the public and the nation's political leadership. And sixth and finally, military operations should only be undertaken if there is no other resort and after all other possibilities have been exhausted. I think you could argue that the Powell-Weinberger Doctrine remained in place in the lead up into Afghanistan, but it disintegrates over Iraq, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. What I'd like to do, and indeed the core of our paper really is about the successes and or failures of the Bush administration in terms of military policies and the fact that we still find ourselves fighting what are essentially 2 regional wars. To highlight the successes quickly, I would say that Rumsfeld's initial series of reforms within the Pentagon actually went really well. Civilian control, for good or bad, was reasserted over the Pentagon. The nation began to reform its force structure. Many of the lessons that were learned in the 1990s in conflicts such as Kosovo, etc., were integrated into military planning. And the result was, and this would be the second success, was you did see that shift away from the Cold War posture to a more mobile, leaner, and effective fighting force. And number 3, in terms of the successes, part of the result of this was the incorporation of 4th-generation warfare and its component network-centric warfare, which was designed to give individual soldiers on the ground total battlefield awareness. And this was really meant to be a force multiplier. So the United States could still accomplish its missions, but it could do it with fewer soldiers because any soldier at any given time would have complete battlefield awareness, would know where other U.S. troops were, would know where the enemy was, etc., and in a way that proved to be very successful. Number 4, in terms of successes, is the initial battle plan and the initial war fighting phases in both Afghanistan and Iraq went very well. The Afghan model that was developed, the use of special operations forces, precision-guided weaponry, turned out to be very effective. We overthrew the Taliban with considerable help from the Northern Alliance, but with relatively few casualties and in a very short period of time. In Iraq, we did with 150,000 troops what it took us more than 500,000 to do a decade earlier. And in Iraq, we had one of the fastest blitzkrieg armored incursions that history has ever seen. So we do argue that the initial warfighting in both Afghanistan and Iraq actually went fairly well. The fifth thing that I would say the Bush administration has done right is the surge. And of course, we'll have to talk about the failures to talk about the surge. There were not enough troops even in the surge as should have been. The failures. And the failures in many ways and to a large extent undermined the successes. The first failure was the effort in Iraq to apply the model that had been developed in Afghanistan. And that was the United States could first pick and choose among coalition forces, so it didn't need to develop the kind of grand coalition that had been developed by the elder Bush. Instead, the United States could rely on a few key allies, could go into Afghanistan in that, or go into Iraq, excuse me, with the expectation that at some point indigenous forces would rise up and the United States would not have to have the large occupying force that many people at the time were predicting. The second failure in these two conflicts was the failure to really take on a counter-narcotics role in Afghanistan. And the reason that was so significant was the Taliban, which ironically had really suppressed the poppy trade when it was in power. After the Taliban was knocked out of power, the Taliban became deeply involved in the drug trade, and it has been what has funded their campaign against the United States. The most recent intelligence estimates are that the Taliban's making somewhere between $25 to as much as $30 million a month on the drug trade, which of course it's using to fund weaponry, to train people, to attract foreign fighters, and so forth. The third mistake that the Bush administration made in these two campaigns was the failure to adequately deal with Pakistan, because Pakistan has now become a haven for the Taliban and continues to be a destabilizing influence in Afghanistan. The fourth failure was the reality that the Bush administration simply put too few boots on the ground in both Afghanistan and Iraq. And this failure ties in with some of the earlier constraints that we talked about. The fact that the American military was designed only to fight one regional war and kind of hold things steady in a second plays out in Iraq and Afghanistan. The reality is the United States does not have the resources to significantly bolster its troop strengths in Afghanistan while maintaining the presence that it has in Iraq. Just after the invasion of Iraq began, then Army Chief of Staff John Shinseki argued that any occupation force in Iraq would need 300 to as many as 350,000 troops. Instead, we tried to do this with 150 to 180, and we see the results. The insurgency was allowed to spread quickly and was only dealt with by later the surge. The final and significant failure in the Iraq campaign was the de-Baathification program, because it really exacerbated the fact that the United States did not have a sufficient number of troops on the ground. Now, you could argue that the Bush administration has taken steps to ameliorate some of its failures. It has begun to try and deal with Pakistan, although its method for dealing with them is probably going to do more long-term harm than benefit. The series of attacks that it's been undertaking may be able to take out some of the Taliban leadership, but the reality is it's also creating a whole new class of anti-Americanism within Pakistan. The emphasis on network-centric warfare has resulted in a failure by the United States to really adequately gain the kind of human intelligence that we used to be able to have. When you have too few troops on the ground, you really prevent yourself from gaining the kind of intelligence, gaining the kind of commitments, the kind of relationships with local populations that are so important in any kind of occupation. The administration has tried to fix that to a certain extent by employing the human terrain teams, going to academia and finding sociologists and anthropologists and deploying them with the troops to try and get a better understanding of the conditions on the ground and forge relationships with local leaders. The administration has done a fairly good job of recruiting local leaders, especially the Sunnis in Iraq, to try and regain some of the stability. And indeed, I would argue that that is as important as the surge was in creating the current levels of stability that we see in Iraq. Ultimately, at the core of our analysis is the argument that the Bush administration was able to achieve a number of tactical victories, a number of tactical successes in Afghanistan and Iraq, but its main failure has been at the strategic level. While it's been able to, for instance, create total battlefield awareness for the individual soldiers, part of what it's done is it's failed to gain total geostrategic awareness at the geostrategic political level. And by concentrating on these tactical levels and on tactical victories, it's lost the larger and more significant strategic battles. And with that, I'll be quiet so that we can hear from our absent comrade and turn it over to you, David.
Tom, thank you, and Larry, thank you. I had occasion to read both of these papers, and I will not add to what the authors have said, I think, except to say that I think they are, if you're seeking kind of a critical overview of Bush foreign policy, that the Korb and Conley paper does an effective job. And if you're interested in more of a kind of a view of the sort of the slice of U.S. warfighting in recent years, I think the Lansford Covarrubias paper is also excellent. In the book project, there will be a third chapter, and I thought I might just briefly summarize that argument, and I don't claim to be able to do it as well as the author might, but Robert J. Kaufman has written a chapter titled, "Is the Bush Doctrine Dead?" And so presumably, since that will be in the book project associated with this panel, I wanted to just say a bit about that. Let me just read you the first sentence or so. Kaufman's chapter opens this way. World War IV began on September 11, 2001, with attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. The Bush administration's strategy for defining and waging this war, the Bush Doctrine, will go down as the president's most pivotal and controversial legacy. He says that the Bush Doctrine has been necessitated by a couple of things. Certainly the way in which he says the events of September 11th showed rudely the inadequacy of deterrence, containment, so on and so forth. Also, it showed that the root causes of September 11th, and similarly its inspired aggression, is the result of a culture of tyranny and oppression in the Middle East. I won't presume to try to summarize all of the details, but say that Kaufman argues that the Bush Doctrine will stand for the foreseeable future. He writes that the general principles of this doctrine will survive and thrive no matter who wins the presidential election of 2008. And he makes the case, this is the concluding sentence of that paper, sooner or later, George W. Bush will receive his due as one of the nation's great foreign policy presidents, on par with President Harry S. Truman. So that will be an interesting, and I will say, diverse section of the book when it comes out on judging Bush. I wanted to take a few moments just to make a couple of my own remarks here. Abraham Lincoln is said to have noted to some close aides that the way that he would be judged in history would be determined overwhelmingly by how the war turned out. You know, he said, I'm paraphrasing, you can forget about, the details of how I decided this and made this choice. It's how it turns out. That's the basis on which I will largely be judged. And I think that I remember saying at the the preceding conference of 4 years ago about the Bush presidency, I gave my own sort of estimate that I thought the Bush presidency would be charged largely and especially with regard to how Iraq turns out. And I think that Lincoln's right. A lot of the other details end up not mattering. I did a lot of research on Lyndon Johnson and the Vietnam War, 2 books on that. And I think what I discovered in my research is that LBJ had a seriousness of purpose that is frequently denied in the books about him. I think that what I discovered, and I know that I wrote about and tried to document, is that he talked to a far more diverse group of advisors than is usually recognized in the history books. But you know, Vietnam didn't turn out well, and he's judged badly on that. And I'm not saying that in a lot of ways he should not be judged badly. So I think Bush will be judged, I still think, by how Iraq turns out, but also, of course, Afghanistan. And regarding this latter country, Afghanistan, I think that the late Senator Richard Russell may have been a kind of an unknowing prophet on this. When it became clear in the mid-60s that President Johnson was taking the nation into war, and against the advice of Senator Russell. Senator Russell was a Southern conservative, Cold War, pro-defense kind of Democrat, but he advised his former protege, LBJ, not to get into that war. A constituent wrote Russell about that, and Russell wrote back, and it was a very sober letter. He said, you know, I think Vietnam is just about the worst, has about the worst possible terrain in the world to fight a war, with the possible exception of Afghanistan. So how things turn out in Iraq and how things turn out in Afghanistan, I think will have a lot to do with what the books, more than maybe we scholars and citizens like to admit, we're awfully focused on the results and less interested sometimes in how we got to those results. This is the point where the authors are invited to comment or question each other about their papers. So let me throw it to you. Do you wish to say anything to each other regarding your respective papers?
A couple comments here on. Don't forget, when we went to Afghanistan and Iraq, this was not Don Rumsfeld's, George Bush's military. This was Bill Clinton's, because it takes you at least 4 to 5 years for a new administration to change. And so when you say that, you know, Rumsfeld came into the Pentagon and felt that the force had really not changed, again, that was a straw man. It may not have changed as rapidly, but in fact, the whole idea of transformation of the Army was started in 1999 by General Shinseki. So I think when you know, my question is, I mean, is it fair to give Rumsfeld all that, you know, sort of credit in the beginning for what happened in Afghanistan, at least initially in Iraq?
Well, I think your points are well taken, and indeed you can make the argument that, you know, the real transformation of the Army actually begins in the 70s, and then accelerates with the end of the Cold War. But I think specifically in terms of force strategy, specifically in terms of deployments, and specifically in terms of how the war was going to be fought, what happened was Rumsfeld tended to listen to those voices in the Pentagon that had been to some extent marginalized during the Clinton years. These were the voices that were emphasizing special operations forces, that were emphasizing a move away from large weapon systems and towards a leaner, you know, more mobile fighting force.
Yeah, again, but if I can come back, it was Bill Cohen that put the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from Special Operations. Right. So, I mean, what I'm trying to say is that, you know, Clinton, in my view, gets a bad rap in terms of what happened with the military. Actually, he spent more on the military than Bush 41 had projected on leaving office, if you put it in real dollars. Not only did he do that, he increased the size of the Marine Corps. Okay, I mean, it was Clinton because Powell was trying. He didn't like the Marines and the Army National Guard. So my point is here that Rumsfeld and Bush in the 2000 campaign really painted a straw man that, you know, the Pentagon was broken, we had to come in, it hadn't really adjusted. In fact, I think it was moving in the direction, and that was proved on the battlefield.
Yeah, I think the truth is probably somewhere in the middle.
I think it's hard to ignore the fact that the United States military is not capability-like. You know, we have the capability to accomplish things. It's happened in the U.S. military. And what you find is the concept of network-centric warfare, fourth-generational warfare is good. It's just not in-depth enough. It doesn't look at enough things. Whether they, you know, change that transformation to include the State Department and economy and all these sorts of things when you look at war fighting is yet to be determined. It probably won't be Obama, though.
Role in some of the military actual operations. As somebody who actually is fairly sympathetic to the notion of being able to privatize certain aspects of government, it seems to me that defense is one of those areas that is a government's core competency. And it is not necessarily an area, say, something like driving school buses, where you may actually think that privatization may work or be a good thing. And so as somebody who doesn't study this part of the field and politics at all, probably the biggest concern to me that I kept seeing over and over again was the use of things like Halliburton and Blackwater and all of these other private forces that seemed almost as though they were mercenaries.
Let me, unless you want to go first, Tom? Go ahead.
I would simply say that I think it is a disturbing trend. Through the 80s and 90s, there was an increased privatization of military functions, especially in the field of logistics. That produced a lot of savings. To some extent, it produced some efficiencies that weren't there before. But I think Pentagon planners through the 90s and into the 2000s took some of the wrong lessons away from that, and that is that everything could be privatized, including security in occupied nations, et cetera. And I would agree, the use of Halliburton, the use of some of these defense contractors, especially to carry out key functions, guarding infrastructure, guarding supply lines, guarding individual political and or security figures in the indigenous country, I think is a mistake.
Let me broaden that to get, did you want to say something, Jack?
Well, this is a point that Tom and I disagree on. I actually think the privatization of the military is a beneficial thing, that it allows the United States government to do things that it otherwise would not be able to do. When you're dealing in an asymmetrical environment, U.S. troops are not always the best representation.
Let me broaden this to get it to a point that Tom and Jack made in their paper. Go back to the creation of the volunteer military. When we created the volunteer military, basically we had kind of four things behind it. One, as they pointed out, we had a comparatively small active duty army. The reason for that was twofold. One, when you went to a volunteer military, you finally had to pay market wages. When I went into the Navy, I took a cut from what I was making as a high school teacher in New York, okay? I got the same pay as my father got in World War II. 2 years you owe the country, you know, okay. So now we were going to at least try and pay market wages, so it would be expensive. Number two, the Army has the toughest time recruiting because they don't have transferable skills. There's not too much demand for people who, you know, have tanks and stuff, whereas the other services you can, you know, the Navy and the Air Force, you can get these transferable skills. Second, we had a Guard and Reserve that were to be a bridge to conscription, which is why we make people register. The Guard and Reserve was supposed to be a strategic reserve, not an operational reserve. And then, of course, we had conscription. And then the fourth thing was we privatized what the military used to call KP. None of the younger people know what that means, the kitchen police, okay? We would privatize that because we wanted these people who we were finally paying something to use them in combat roles. Now what happened is, this army particularly was not built for long wars. When I thought going to Iraq was unnecessary. Okay, but if you want to go into Iraq, then what you should have done is you should have brought back the draft, because Tom pointed out we didn't have enough troops for both things. Well, okay, you want to have 2 wars, you're going to have to do it. And so what you did was you overused the active force. We set a policy when I was there, and I think it's both right morally as well as operationally. For every year you spend in a combat zone, or every day, you should spend 2 at home. Okay? The combat forces aren't getting that. You've had people 3, 4, 5 tours there. Number 2, Guard and Reserve 1 year out of every 5 years. But we, obviously have done that. They're rotating with the active forces. Okay. Then you've overused the private to fill in the gap, okay? And you've got them doing things that they shouldn't. Even if you argue that some of the stuff is cheaper and all that, the fact of the matter is the government should have a monopoly of force, and you've seen the problems. I mean, what they did in Fallujah, they were told to stay out of it. They went in, they got hung, and then of course we had the Battle of Fallujah, and a lot of people died. So what you've done here basically by, and I mentioned a little bit in my paper, one of the Bush legacies, you're going to leave a broken army. They can use all these euphemistic things, but it's broken. Do you realize to get people to volunteer for this unpopular war, we've lowered our educational, 800 felons were taken in. You can't get drafted by the NFL, okay, with that, and they're taking them in. So this is what's happened when you try and do it. Now, if you're for the war, okay, fine. You voted for Bush, well, go down and register for the draft, okay? I mean, basically. So what's happened, I think, if you put it in this larger, larger context, and that's the problem what we have, and that's why we've had to overuse these private things.
Well, luckily, the downturn in the economy has meant recruitment levels are up 10 to 15%. So that problem's solved.
No, it's not. I mean, it's up to 81% high school graduates. Okay.
We have time for one more question and a few minutes for some kind of an answer.
Okay. I have sort of a philosophical question. I've had the benefit to read all 3 papers, and Professor Hoffman discusses sort of the theoretical backing for war. So basically, Michael Walker and some scholars discussed what are just wars. Would you say that the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war, in your opinion, were just wars? And second of all, would you say that does the end justify the means? If you have a successful outcome, does it matter that the problem's getting there?
I think Bush handled the Afghanistan war exactly right up until he went in. Because remember, he told the Taliban, because he didn't go in with NATO, he told the Taliban, if you turn over al-Qaeda, this was not regime change and all this. This is before this doctrine is written. Now, when you don't turn over, okay, we're going to come in, and you did have UN authorization, NATO invoked Article 5. My problem was you should have gone in with NATO, it would have been better for the taxpayer and for our forces. Perfectly just. Iraq was not, because you claimed that you were going in because of the UN sanctions and the WMD. If you're going to wage a preventive war, so if I can use a legal analogy, you've got to have proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and there was not proof. And if you were going with the UN thing, why didn't you let the inspectors do their job? They were in there. El Baradei, after Colin Powell gave that talk, said, there's no nuclear weapons there. Yeah, we can tell you, absolutely, there's none. The CIA was actually sent a lot of Iraqi Americans who were related to people developing. They sent them back there, and they came back and they said, it's not there. What was the rush? Why'd you have to go? I mean, and you said you were doing with the UN authorization, but you put 300,000 people in the theater. It was use it or lose it. Nobody knew you would leave them there over the summer. So that's what I mean. In my view, it was not a just war, and it doesn't matter how it comes out. I don't think Iraq is going to be a democracy and all of that. Let me just sum it up here, and Frank Fukuyama said it very well. He said, if you had told the American people back in 2003 that you were going to Iraq, over 4,000, dead, how many wounded, we don't know. One of the interesting things is the Pentagon, when they count the wounded, it's 32,000. But I did some checking. 75,000 people have been evacuated from the theater because of, if you get, the IED blows up and you get wounded, that's okay. But if I'm in the truck behind it and I hit that, that doesn't count as a combat, wound, okay? So it's really 75,000. Heaven knows how many Iraqis we've killed. How much are we spending? Stiglitz, tells it might be 3. So Iraq could have an election, you'd have been laughed out of the ballpark. And I think that really sums up the thing. No, I don't think it's moral, and it has caused more long-term damage both to the American military, our reputation, and our standing in the world. Aaron David Miller's new book puts it pretty well. He said, we're not liked, we're not respected, and we're not feared anymore in the world.
I would actually agree with the first part. I think Afghanistan was a just war. I do have to take a little bit of exception to the idea that we did not use NATO in Afghanistan. I did a book on NATO's response to 9/11, All for One NATO, the United States, and terrorism. And NATO did have a role. Part of what happened with NATO were individual national constraints on how the troops could be used, where they could be used, something that you see playing out to this day with NATO's current mission. To a large extent, this worked very well with what the United States wanted to do, which was to have a greater unity of command in Afghanistan than it had in previous coalition operations. So I would tend to argue that NATO did have a more significant role than might have been suggested. In terms of Iraq, I think there was a great quote that Madeleine Albright mentioned in an article in Foreign Affairs where she said, the French were willing to go with us into Iraq if we had given the inspectors 6 more months. And I think Larry hit it right on the head, though. Once you get 300,000 troops deployed in the region and you're face-to-face with the issue of we can go to war in March or we can go to war in August. And we did August last time, and that didn't turn out very well in terms of what the troops had to go through. So if we're going to do this, let's just do it and get it out of the way. Jeremy, I think the only way you could argue that Iraq was a just war is if, in fact, you take out the whole idea of preventative war and preemptive war, and instead argue that Iraq was done to remove a brutal dictator who had killed several 100,000 of his own people. And then I think you can develop an argument in favor of going to war, but that raises, why Iraq, why not Darfur, why not, and so forth.
It could almost go without saying that Robert Kaufman in his chapter argues that both of these wars were necessary. I predicted some minutes ago that Bush would be large judgely on how these 2 wars turn out. It's a hope, it's not a prediction. I hope that a big part of the basis for judging his presidency is focused on whether these 2 wars were necessary. I hope that's a big part of the analyses that come in these decades ahead of us. This has been a great panel. I enjoyed moderating it, and my thanks to Larry Korb. I realize his co-author is not here, but she is Laura Conley, and also Tom Lansford and Jack Covarrubias. Thank you very much, and thank you.